Naomi Carter's cloth moved in steady circles over the polished oak desk, the faint scent of furniture wax lingering in the air. The morning light fell in muted ribbons through the tall windows, catching the fine dust in its path. She paused only when Ranger, the estate's seasoned canine, padded into the study and stopped near the far wall, ears pricked, gaze locked. Sliding the framed landscape aside, Naomi's breath hitched. The vault door, solid steel and meant to be immovable, was ajar by an inch. She could see the edges of crisp $100 bills inside, stacked with unnerving precision. A sound behind her broke the moment. Dean Walters, the long-serving butler, stood in the doorway, his pale blue eyes unreadable, his voice cool and precise. "The safe is not your concern," he said. Her hands stilled, not from guilt, but from the sting of being spoken to like a thief. She hadn't touched a thing, yet the air between them felt charged, heavy with something neither of them dared name. Somewhere beyond the polished calm of the room, Naomi knew, a truth waited, sharp-edged, and dangerous. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel to see the next stories by clicking the subscribe button right below the video. Thank you, amen. The last remnants of autumn clung stubbornly to the trees in the hills of Vermont. A low mist lingered above the forest floor, curling through the iron gates of the Hollis estate like a slow breath. The sprawling, centuries-old mansion sat at the crest of a winding drive, its pale stone walls weathered by decades of snow and rain. That morning, the sky was the dull silver of pewter, promising rain later, and the air carried the faint, bittersweet scent of decaying leaves mixed with wood smoke from the chimneys. Naomi Carter adjusted the collar of her crisp navy and white maid's uniform as she stepped from the servants' wing into the main hallway. At 25, Naomi was of medium height, but carried herself with the quiet, upright poise of someone used to making herself unnoticed. Her skin was deep and warm-toned, her dark brown eyes alert yet guarded, framed by naturally arched brows. A faint, pale scar traced along her left forearm, an old reminder from a kitchen accident in her first job as a housemaid, when a tray of scalding coffee had tipped over. That incident had taught her caution and precision, traits that had become part of her daily rhythm. She moved with the economy of a dancer, swift, quiet steps, hands steady qualities that made her valuable to wealthy employers who disliked disruptions. Naomi's manner with people was polite but reserved. She had learned early that keeping one's own counsel often meant keeping one's job. Beneath that restraint lay a sharper truth. She was working toward a very personal goal, to save enough to repair her late mother's collapsing farmhouse roof before the Vermont winter set in, the kind of winter that didn't forgive neglect. The Hollis estate, though stately, was not without its shadows. Richard Hollis, its owner, was a man in his late 50s with a tall, broad frame and a streak of steel gray in his otherwise black hair. Once a venture capitalist in Boston, he had retreated to this estate 5 years earlier after a bitter divorce and a failed high-profile investment that had dragged his name through the financial pages. His angular face, marked by deep lines at the corners of his eyes, gave the impression of constant calculation. Around staff, he was not unkind, but he had the watchful, slightly distant demeanor of someone who trusted slowly, if at all. The only creature in the house who seemed wholly without pretense was Ranger, the estate's canine shepherd. Ranger was a 6-year-old German shepherd with a powerful, athletic build and a coat of deep sable black along his back that faded into tawny brown on his legs and chest. His right ear had a small nick from an old training incident. His amber eyes, bright and intelligent, often followed Naomi with the familiarity of a companion who had chosen her as his preferred human. Ranger's usual temperament was calm and obedient, a product of his years as a police service dog before Richard adopted him from the county's retiring canine program. He was a creature of habit, rarely barking without cause. It was still early, the kind of quiet hour before the estate's main household stirred. Naomi entered Richard's study to dust the oak paneling and the tall bookshelves that lined the walls. The study was warm from the low fire in the hearth, the faint scent of leather-bound volumes and cigar smoke hanging in the air. A wide antique desk sat near the center of the room, its surface neat except for a blotter, a fountain pen, and a stack of unopened mail. Against the far wall, half hidden behind a framed landscape of the Green Mountains, stood the estate's wall safe, an old, heavy model with a steel door polished to a muted shine. As Naomi moved along the east wall, her cloth in hand, she noticed something unusual. The framed painting above the safe was slightly askew, and the heavy steel door behind it was not fully shut. Her gaze flicked instinctively to the gap, barely an inch wide, but enough to reveal a sliver of the interior. She set down the dustcloth and stepped closer, every sense sharpening. Pulling the painting aside, she eased the safe door open just far enough to see inside. Her breath caught. Bundles of US $100 bills were stacked in neat rows, each wrapped with bank straps, the green edges crisp against the dim interior light. The sheer amount was staggering, far beyond anything she'd seen up close before. Before she could process the sight, a low, guttural growl rolled through the room. Naomi's head turned sharply to the arched doorway. Ranger stood there, hackles raised, his gaze locked not on her, but on the bottom corner of the safe. His stance was taut, one paw slightly lifted, tail rigid. "Ranger?" Naomi's voice was low, uncertain. She had never seen him like this. The shepherd took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the inside of the safe. His lips curled back just enough to show the white tips of his teeth. Naomi followed his line of sight and noticed something odd beneath the stacks of cash. At the seam where the safe's floor met its wall, there was a thin, dark slit, as if the metal plate didn't quite fit flush. She crouched slightly, peering closer but didn't touch. Ranger's growl deepened, the kind of sound that prickled the back of the neck. It was a warning of what, she couldn't yet tell. A floorboard creaked somewhere down the hall, pulling her upright. She swung the safe door back into its nearly shut position and straightened the painting, all in one smooth motion. Ranger moved to stand beside her, still alert but no longer vocalizing, his presence both unsettling and strangely protective. Naomi resumed her dusting with deliberate calm, though her heart was beating faster now. She didn't know what was hidden beneath those bundles of cash, but whatever it was had unsettled the most disciplined creature in the house. And that, she knew, meant it wasn't something to ignore. The rain promised by yesterday's silver sky had come in the night, and by morning, the Hollis estate was wrapped in a curtain of mist, so dense that the treetops disappeared into it. The gravel driveway glistened with moisture, and the scent of damp earth clung to every breath. Naomi Carter stood at the tall kitchen window before her shift began, sipping coffee from the chipped white mug she kept hidden at the back of the cupboard. She watched a lone crow hop along the stone path outside, its feathers slick and shining. Her mind replayed yesterday's moment in Richard's study, the sliver of steel at the bottom of the safe, the way Ranger's growl had seemed to rise from some deep, instinctive place. Naomi wasn't given to paranoia, but she wasn't foolish either. She knew the difference between an overactive imagination and a warning you'd be a fool to ignore. And Ranger, for all his quiet obedience, had never given a warning without reason. Her goal remained clear in her mind. Survive the next 3 months, save every dollar she could, and get the roof of her late mother's farmhouse patched before the first snow weighed it down into ruin. Trouble was the one thing she couldn't afford. Trouble cost time, and time was money she didn't have. By mid-morning she had slipped into her uniform, tied her apron tight, and began the day's chores. The kitchen smelled of yeast and butter-fresh bread rising in covered bowls along the counter. Behind the kitchen island at the big oak prep table, Evelyn Hart was already at work chopping herbs. Evelyn was a woman in her late 60s, with a sturdy build softened by years of baking and hearty laughter. Her hair, once a deep auburn, was now more silver than red, worn in a loose twist at the back of her head. She had the kind of face that could go from stern to warm in a heartbeat, and eyes that carried both the sharpness of a woman who'd seen much and the gentleness of one who chose not to speak of all of it. Evelyn had been in service at Hollis Estate since the time of Richard's father, and though she rarely volunteered personal details, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who remembered every change this house had endured. Naomi greeted her with a polite, "Morning," and began wiping down the counter near the pantry. Evelyn glanced over the rims of her reading glasses, set down her knife, and leaned her elbows on the table. "You ever hear the story about this place?" Evelyn asked, voice low. "Before Richard owned it?" Naomi shook her head. "Only that it's been in his family for generations." "That's the polite version," Evelyn said, lips curling into something between a smile and a frown. Back in the 70s, when his uncle ran the estate, there were whispers about a side business. Nothing legal. Smuggling, maybe. Laundering money through fake charities. Folks said they hid the profits somewhere in this very house. She shrugged. "No one ever proved it. But people notice when a man goes from nearly bankrupt to buying a second yacht in 2 years. Naomi kept her expression neutral, though the words pressed into her thoughts. She didn't mention the open safe or Ranger's reaction. Evelyn's story was unsettling enough without adding yesterday's discovery. It was just after lunch when Naomi heard it, the sound of footsteps below the floorboards, slow but deliberate, coming from the direction of the basement. She paused in the hallway outside the library, listening. The sound stopped, then resumed, accompanied by the faint scrape of metal on concrete. Curiosity gnawed at her. The basement was used mostly for storage wine racks, old furniture, and a laundry room. Staff went down there only when needed, and Naomi had been down just twice since she started working here. She moved toward the service stairs, her shoes silent on the carpeted hall. Ranger appeared at her side as if summoned, his nails clicking softly against the polished wood. His ears were pricked forward, and his head tilted slightly toward the stairs. "Not now," Naomi whispered, but the shepherd didn't break stride. As she reached the top of the narrow staircase, the footsteps stopped again. She stood listening, holding her breath. Nothing but the hum of the furnace. Finally, she stepped back, deciding against descending. Someone might catch her wandering where she had no business. Later that afternoon, while dusting the formal dining room, Naomi overheard 2 other staff members talking in the hall, Thomas, the groundskeeper, and Lila, the housemaid from the East Wing. Thomas was a man in his mid-40s, lean from years of outdoor work, with a weathered face and sun-browned skin. His speech carried the slow rhythm of a Vermont native who'd never lived anywhere else. "Basement's locked from the inside again," he said. "Had to get Dean to open it this morning." Dean Walters. The head butler was a man Naomi avoided whenever possible. In his early 60s, tall and still broad-shouldered, Dean wore his silver hair slicked back and had a voice that could cut glass. He'd been with Richard for over 2 decades, and his authority over the staff was second only to the master of the house. Naomi had never seen him smile without it looking rehearsed. That evening, as the household wound down, Naomi stayed later in the kitchen under the pretext of scrubbing the floor tiles. Evelyn was wiping down the counters when she spoke again, her tone quieter than before. "Whatever you do, Naomi, don't go poking your nose where it doesn't belong. This house—" She hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the darkened hall beyond. "Has long memories, and not all of them are kind." Naomi met her eyes, reading the unspoken warning there. But the thought of the open safe, the slit in the metal, and Ranger's reaction would not leave her. Secrets, she knew, had weight, and if there was something dangerous in this house, she needed to understand it, if only to keep herself out of its path. The rain started again just before midnight, tapping steadily against her attic window in the servants' quarters. Naomi lay awake, listening, her mind circling the same questions. Why was the safe left open? What had unsettled Ranger? And who was in the basement last night? By the time she drifted into sleep, she had made a quiet decision. She would find out, but she would do it carefully, in the small, unnoticed spaces between her duties. She couldn't afford recklessness, but she also couldn't afford ignorance. Downstairs, in the study, the safe stood closed and silent behind its framed painting. And somewhere beneath the house, in the concrete-walled rooms where few dared linger, a faint metallic scent clung to the air, waiting for the next person curious or foolish enough to follow it. By the next morning, the rain had eased into a low, persistent drizzle that clung to the windows and turned the gardens outside into blurred watercolors of green and brown. The Hollis estate felt quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that made every footstep echo more than it should. Naomi Carter moved through her chores with deliberate precision, biding her time until she could be alone in the study again. She had been replaying yesterday's sounds from the basement in her head, and the memory of Ranger's reaction to the safe had not loosened its grip on her thoughts. The chance came just after 11 o'clock. Richard was in town for a meeting with his financial advisor, and Dean Walters had been called to the wine cellar to inspect a delivery. Naomi took the polished brass key from her apron pocket, a master key for staff cleaning access, and eased open the door to the study. The room was lit only by the gray daylight seeping through half-drawn curtains. The faint scent of cigar smoke still lingered from the previous night. Ranger padded in behind her, nails clicking softly against the hardwood. His ears were forward, tail held low but steady, his amber gaze fixed on the far wall where the painting hung. Naomi approached the safe, slid the heavy painting aside, and turned the steel handle. The door yielded with a slow, metallic groan. The stacks of money looked just as they had before, neat and unassuming in their order, but Naomi's eyes dropped lower, toward the seam at the bottom. She knelt, pushing her braid over one shoulder to keep it out of the way, and traced the edge of the floor plate with her fingertips. It felt wrong, not flush with the frame, as though it could be lifted. Ranger moved in closer, his head low, his breath warm against her sleeve. Then, without warning, he began barking sharply, his forepaws striking the edge of the safe's floor with force. The metallic clang rang through the room. "Ranger, quiet!" Naomi hissed, glancing toward the door. But the shepherd ignored her, his claws scraping against the metal, his whole body tense as if ready to dig through it. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her freeze. She had only a second before the door swung open and Dean Walters stepped inside. Dean was dressed as always in his black waistcoat and crisp white shirt, the silver chain of his pocket watch glinting under the light. His tall frame filled the doorway, and his pale blue eyes, usually blank and unreadable, narrowed as they took in the scene. His slicked-back silver hair glistened faintly from the damp air outside. "What?" he said, his voice low but edged with steel. "Are you doing?" Naomi stood quickly, brushing off her apron. "Cleaning, Mr. Walters. I noticed the safe was—" "You noticed nothing," Dean interrupted, stepping forward until his shadow fell over the open door. "Your job is the desk, the shelves, the floors. The safe is not your concern." Ranger's growl rumbled in his chest again, directed squarely at Dean now. Dean glanced down at him, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly before shifting his gaze back to Naomi. "Take him and leave, now." Naomi swallowed, nodded, and called Ranger to her side. The shepherd obeyed but kept his eyes on Dean as they passed. Back in the kitchen she found Evelyn Hart alone, rolling out dough on the long oak table. The smell of cinnamon and butter hung in the air. Naomi hesitated before speaking, her voice low. "Evelyn, has Dean always had access to the safe?" Evelyn paused, dusted her hands with flour, and looked up. "Longer than Richard has," she said. "When Mr. Hollis is away, which is often, Dean handles all matters of security, keys, codes, the works. That was the arrangement even before Richard inherited the place. Why?" Naomi shook her head, choosing her words carefully. "Just curious. He seemed very protective of it." Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly, as though weighing whether to say more. "Protective is one word for it. I've seen him stand guard over that safe like it was his own. Years ago, when Richard's father died, Dean was the one who managed all the estate's assets until the will was settled. That's a long time to have his hands in the coffers." Before Naomi could reply, the back door opened and Thomas, the groundskeeper, stepped in carrying a crate of damp firewood. His boots left muddy prints on the floor as he set the crate down. "Dean's in a foul mood," he said to Evelyn without noticing Naomi. "Ran into him by the cellar stairs, told me to mind my work when I asked about the new locks." Evelyn glanced at Naomi, then back to her dough. "See what I mean?" she said quietly. Later that evening, Naomi returned to her attic room in the servants' quarters. She sat on the edge of her bed, absently rubbing the spot on her forearm where the scar lay, thinking about the safe's hidden panel and Dean's reaction. The drizzle outside had turned into a steady rain, the drops pattering against the sloped roof above her head. Ranger lay at the foot of the bed, eyes half closed but ears twitching at every creak of the old house. Naomi reached down to scratch behind his ear. "You know something's wrong too, don't you?" she murmured. His tail thumped once in reply. The thought settled like a weight in her chest. Dean Walters wasn't just guarding that safe, he was guarding whatever secret lay beneath its floor. And if Evelyn's stories about his long-standing control over the keys were true, then he had both the access and the motive to keep it hidden. For now, Naomi decided the best course was to keep her suspicions to herself. But she also knew that secrets had a way of surfacing, and when they did, she intended to be ready. The rain had moved on overnight, leaving the air brittle with cold, and the lawns of the Hollis estate coated in a silver frost that caught the pale morning sun. Naomi Carter moved through the kitchen with her usual quiet efficiency, but her mind was far from the trays of polished silverware and steaming mugs of tea she carried to the dining room. She had already made up her mind. Today she would plant the camera. The idea had come to her the night before while she lay awake. staring at the shadowy beams of her attic ceiling. Her nephew, Jamal, a quick-witted 16-year-old who lived in the neighboring town, had shown her his new gadget 2 weeks earlier during a rare Sunday visit, a miniature camera no larger than a shirt button, bought online with saved-up earnings from mowing lawns. "Good for my skateboarding videos," he'd said with a grin. Naomi had asked to borrow it without explaining why. By mid-morning, she slipped into the study while the rest of the household was occupied. The curtains were half drawn, the fire in the grate still smoldering from Richard's earlier visit. Ranger followed her in, tail wagging softly, but Naomi gestured for him to wait near the door. She moved to the far wall, slid the painting aside, and examined the frame of the safe. The camera, black and unobtrusive, fit snugly into the carved corner of the wooden molding above the safe, its lens angled toward the door. Naomi pressed the tiny switch to activate it, then stepped back, heart pounding. If Dean noticed it, the plan would be over before it began. For the rest of the day, she worked with deliberate calm, careful to avoid any hint that she was watching the clock. At supper, Evelyn served roast chicken and potatoes, chatting with Thomas and Lila about the early frost. Dean was not present, apparently overseeing inventory in the wine cellar, according to Lila. Naomi ate little, her mind fixed on the camera recording silently upstairs. Night fell early, the darkness settling over the estate like a heavy blanket. The wind picked up, rattling the bare branches outside Naomi's small window. She waited until she was certain the main lights had gone out before slipping down the back staircase and into the servants' corridor. Ranger followed, but when they reached the study, she found the door locked. She crouched near the keyhole, listening. A faint metallic click came from within, followed by the slow groan of the safe door. She glanced toward the hall just in time to see a shadow move past the crack under the door Dean's tall frame, unmistakable even in silhouette. Inside, the camera's small light blinked once. Naomi imagined its tiny lens capturing every detail, Dean's precise movements as he reached into the safe, pulling out a thick envelope and a small, unmarked USB drive. He tucked both into the inner pocket of his waistcoat, the gesture practiced and unhurried. Ranger let out a sharp bark from the hall, his body pressing toward the door. Naomi grabbed his collar, but the shepherd barked again, claws scraping against the wood. Inside, Dean froze. She heard his footsteps approach, then the sound of a latch turning. Naomi retreated quickly, pulling Ranger toward the shadows of the corridor. The study door opened just enough for Dean's pale blue eyes to sweep the hall. Seeing no one, he shut it again. Naomi's pulse was hammering in her ears. She'd caught him, she was sure of it, but catching him on camera was one thing, acting on it was another. Later, back in her attic room, Naomi retrieved the camera and connected it to her laptop, a gift from her sister years ago, its screen faintly flickering at the edges. The footage was clear. Dean entering, opening the safe, removing the envelope and USB, and leaving. Ranger's barking echoed faintly from outside the frame. She sat back in her chair, staring at the paused image of Dean's hand slipping the USB into his pocket. The choice loomed heavy in her mind: march straight to Richard with the proof, or wait, gather more, and risk Dean catching on. Her thoughts drifted to an incident from her first year working in service at a different house, under a different master, when a maid had accused a senior staff member of theft without sufficient proof. The maid had been dismissed within the week, her reputation ruined. Naomi had promised herself she would never make a move without a certainty that could not be denied. Downstairs, the grandfather clock struck midnight. Naomi closed the laptop, her decision made. One more night. She would follow Dean's movements, see where the envelope and USB went, and then take everything to Richard at once. It was a calculated risk. And as she lay in bed, Ranger stretched out at her feet. The distant sound of a door closing somewhere in the house made her eyes snap open. Something had shifted in the air, a sense of movement beneath the calm, like a trap being set. She didn't yet know whether she was the hunter or the prey. The morning broke with a brittle clarity, sunlight glancing off the frost-covered lawns and spilling into the long windows of the Hollis estate. Naomi Carter was polishing the silver tray in the butler's pantry when she heard Evelyn's voice call from the corridor. "Naomi, Mr. Hollis wants you in his office, now." The older woman's tone was cautious, her eyes avoiding Naomi's as she passed the doorway. That alone made Naomi's pulse quicken. She smoothed the front of her uniform, wiped her hands on her apron, and made her way through the east hall toward the grand staircase. The house felt different this morning, hushed, but not with the comfortable stillness she knew. It was the kind of silence that settled just before a storm. Richard Hollis's office was a study in controlled elegance, dark walnut shelves lined with leather-bound books, a broad desk of polished mahogany, and a tall window looking out toward the bare trees at the edge of the property. Richard himself sat behind the desk, his tall frame leaning back slightly in the leather chair. His steel-gray hair was combed neatly, and his deep-set eyes were fixed on her with a weight that made her slow her steps. On the desk between them lay a small black USB drive. "I found this," Richard said, his voice measured but edged with something harder. "In your cleaning tote." Naomi blinked, the words catching in her throat. "Sir, He held up a hand to stop her. "Before you explain, I need to tell you that this particular device was in my safe yesterday morning, and last night it wasn't." Her mind spun. She had seen that exact drive in Dean Walters' hand when she reviewed the footage from the hidden camera, but she had left it where it was. There was no way it should have been in her possession. Her stomach tightened as the truth landed. Dean had planted it. Dean chose that moment to enter the office, tall and imposing in his black waistcoat, silver hair glinting under the light. His expression was the picture of calm professionalism, but his pale blue eyes held the faintest trace of triumph. "Mr. Hollis," he said smoothly, "I thought you might want to hear directly from her." Naomi opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, Ranger burst through the half-open door. The German shepherd moved like a streak of muscle and fur, heading straight for Dean. With a sharp growl, Ranger grabbed hold of the edge of Dean's coat sleeve and yanked hard. "What the—" Dean stumbled back, his composure cracking. In the scuffle, something clinked against the floor, an ornate brass key attached to a short chain. It skidded across the carpet, stopping near Richard's chair. A moment later, a thick envelope tumbled from Dean's inner pocket, landing face up with the seal of Vermont National Bank clearly visible. Richard stood, his eyes narrowing as he bent to pick up the envelope. He slid it open with the paper knife from his desk, pulling out a stack of documents. The room seemed to hold its breath as he flipped through them: bank statements, transfer receipts, and a signed authorization form bearing Dean's name. "These are charity fund withdrawals," Richard said slowly, his voice low but deadly calm, "from the Hollis Foundation account." His eyes lifted to Dean, and the air between them felt charged. Dean's face had lost its color, but he forced a laugh. "Sir, this is absurd. Those documents show a pattern of withdrawals over 2 years, Richard cut in, his voice sharp. "And judging by the signatures, you've been forging authorizations while I was away." Naomi stood frozen, her hands clenched at her sides. The scene felt almost unreal, the layers of suspicion and maneuvering collapsing in a single moment. Ranger had planted himself between her and Dean now, his amber eyes locked on the man with a protective intensity that needed no explanation. Richard turned to her, his expression shifting from suspicion to something heavier, more thoughtful. "Naomi," he said, "I owe you an apology." "You owe her more than that," Evelyn's voice came from the doorway. She had followed the commotion upstairs, her flour-dusted apron still on. "She's been the one keeping this place together while you were busy believing the wrong people." Dean's gaze darted to the door, but Richard's voice stopped him cold. "You'll stay right where you are until the authorities arrive." He pressed a button on the phone at his desk. "Sheriff's office, please." Naomi felt the knot in her chest begin to ease, though her pulse was still racing. The trap Dean had set for her had snapped shut, but not on her, and while she hadn't intended for the confrontation to happen this way, there was no denying the relief that came with the truth finally surfacing. As Richard spoke into the phone, Ranger moved closer to Naomi, leaning subtly against her leg. She reached down to scratch behind his ear, her gratitude for the dog's instinctive loyalty stronger than she could put into words. She glanced at Dean, who now stood rigid, his jaw tight, eyes fixed on some point beyond the window. For the first time since she had arrived at Hollis Estate, Naomi saw him stripped of the authority he had wielded so easily. The balance in the room had shifted, and Naomi knew, as the sound of approaching sirens began to echo faintly in the cold Vermont air, that nothing in this house would be quite the same again. By mid-afternoon, the Vermont air had turned sharper, the cold sunlight falling in slanted beams through the tall windows of the Hollis estate. Outside, a few stubborn leaves still clung to the skeletal branches, rattling in the wind as if reluctant to let go. Inside, the mood was subdued, but taut with the lingering aftershock of the morning's confrontation. Dean Walters had been escorted out less than an hour ago, his measured steps down the marble foyer echoing like a reluctant farewell. The sheriff's cruiser rolled slowly down the gravel drive, crunching over frost-hardened stones until it disappeared behind the gate. Richard Hollis stood at the base of the grand staircase, one hand resting lightly on the polished banister. The light from the chandelier above cast a warm glow over his angular features, softening them. He was dressed more casually than usual, dark trousers and a thick navy sweater, but his posture carried the same quiet authority. "Naomi," he said, beckoning her toward him. She approached, still uncertain how to stand in this new chapter of the day. The adrenaline had ebbed, leaving her with a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. Ranger padded faithfully at her side, head level with her hip, his amber eyes tracking Richard's every movement. "I've been thinking," Richard began, his voice calm but deliberate. "It's clear to me now that I've been trusting the wrong people and overlooking the right ones. You've shown judgment, loyalty, and discretion in a way I can't put a price on. I want you to take on a new role here, overseeing the interiors, the household's valuable pieces, and the management of our secure holdings. You'd have full authority in that regard." He paused, the corner of his mouth lifting faintly. "The pay would reflect that responsibility, double what you're earning now." Naomi blinked, taken aback. The magnitude of the offer was almost too much to process at once. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks but steadied her voice. "Thank you, sir. I'll do my best." "I have no doubt," Richard replied, extending his hand. She shook it, the gesture sealing something far more significant than a professional agreement. It was a restoration of trust. Later, in the kitchen, Evelyn Hart was pulling a tray of fresh cornbread from the oven when Naomi walked in. The warm scent of butter and cornmeal filled the air. Evelyn, still in her flour-dusted apron, set the tray on the counter and looked Naomi over with the shrewd eyes of someone who could read more than what was said aloud. "Big changes upstairs, I hear," Evelyn said, her tone carrying both curiosity and approval. Naomi smiled faintly. "Seems that way." Evelyn leaned in a little, lowering her voice as though sharing a secret. "Richard told me something before you came in. That money in the safe, the clean portion of it, mind you, he's setting aside for a new staff relief fund. For former employees who fell on hard times. He wants you to manage it." The words sank in, warm and unexpected. "Me?" Naomi asked. "You," Evelyn confirmed with a small smile. "You're the one who proved this place still has a soul worth protecting. Seems fitting you'd be the one to make sure that money does some good." She wiped her hands on her apron. "I imagine that'll cover more than a few projects, including that roof you keep worrying about." Naomi felt a quiet swell of gratitude. Her mind flicked briefly to her mother's old farmhouse. The sagging roofline she had feared might not survive the winter. This role, this trust meant she could see it safe without the grinding uncertainty that had followed her for years. In the days that followed, the rhythm of the house settled into something new. Without Dean's constant presence, the atmosphere was lighter, conversations less guarded. Staff who had once moved through their duties with downcast eyes now lingered to share a word or two in the hallways. Ranger became Naomi's near-constant shadow, padding beside her as she conducted inventories, inspected storerooms, and took note of which items needed conservation. One afternoon, she found herself in the attic storage room, going over a ledger of the estate's older acquisitions. Ranger sat by the door, ears pricked at the faint scurry of mice in the walls. Naomi ran her fingertips over the worn leather spine of a catalog older than she was, thinking about how strange it felt to be the one with the keys, now both literal and figurative. That evening, as twilight fell and the first wood smoke of the night curled up from the chimneys, Naomi sat in the small sitting room off the kitchen. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a warm orange glow that flickered over the room's worn armchairs and braided rugs. Ranger lay stretched out beside the hearth, his head resting on his paws, eyes half-lidded in the kind of contentment only a dog secure in his place could know. Naomi cradled a mug of tea between her hands, letting the steam warm her face. Her gaze drifted to the dog, and an unbidden smile spread across her lips. She had come here hoping only to keep her head down, save her money, and patch her mother's roof. Instead, she had walked through suspicion, risk, and betrayal, and emerged not just with her livelihood intact, but with her dignity and purpose strengthened. She reached down to scratch behind Ranger's ear. "We did all right, didn't we?" she murmured. His tail thumped once against the rug. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches, but inside, the air was warm, the fire steady. For the first time in a long time, Naomi felt not like someone surviving on borrowed time, but like someone who belonged exactly where she was. In the end, Naomi's journey reminds us that doing what is right is not always the easiest path, but it is always the one worth walking. In our daily lives, we all face moments when we could stay silent or step forward, when we could turn away or stand firm. Sometimes, courage is not loud or dramatic. It is the quiet decision to hold on to our integrity, even when no one is watching. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that honesty and loyalty can still change the course of a life. Leave a comment below and tell us your thoughts, and if you believe in the power of truth and trust, write Amen in the comments. Do not forget to subscribe for more stories like this, and may God bless everyone who watches and supports.